Nkateko Nyoka. Thanks very much for joining us. Welcome to the program.
My pleasure, and thank you for inviting me to your program.
Okay, so you've just heard Nkosana Makate speaking to one of my colleagues earlier on today. Is there anything that he said that you'd like to dispute or give clarity on?
Look, I think the main issue that he was addressing is the fact that he has, or he is planning to initiate a review by the courts of the determination of the Vodacom Group CEO, who was essentially designated that role by the Constitutional Court. I suppose he is dissatisfied with the amount that has been set by the CEO as constituting reasonable compensation for the idea that he brought to Vodacom approximately 18 years ago.
All right, so there's a couple of issues I'd like to get some clarity on. First of all, the inventor of this Please Call Me, it's coming up that somebody at MTN brought it up and that it was patented by MTN even before Mr. Makate came to you with his idea, and that the idea that Vodacom eventually went with was different from the one he presented. If that's the case, then what are you actually paying for? So
a starting point is Vodacom and Mr. Makate didn't have a contract, or let me say a written contract, for Vodacom to compensate Mr. Makate for the buzz idea that he brought to Vodacom. But it does appear that he had conversation with a former employee of Vodacom, and there was an understanding that if his idea is tested and proven to be both technically and commercially feasible, then they would talk compensation. Of course, it is a fact that after a protracted legal battle, Mr. Makate was able to persuade the courts in South Africa that he did have a contract or an agreement to agree. That was the ruling of the Constitutional Court, but the court went further and said, well, because there was a term outstanding in the contract, the parties need to enter into bona fide negotiations and agree reasonable compensation payable to Mr. Makate. Those negotiations took place between May of 2016 to about end of 2017 and deadlocked.
All right, so I think we're quite clear about what happens next. So essentially what you're saying is, had the courts not ruled that there was an agreement, your position was that there wasn't one in the first instance. That's and right. That you shouldn't be having to pay. The courts decided differently, and that's why you're having to pay. Then comes the question of how does one calculate what fair compensation is? What might have gone through the mind of the CEO?
So I'm not at liberty to talk about the factors that the CEO took into account and came or determined the number that was subsequently presented to Mr. Makate as a final determination, largely because there is a confidentiality agreement that exists between Mr. Makate and Vodacom. But I suppose, as he has said, he's referring the matter now to the courts. Once the application for the review is in the courts, all that information will become public when the issues are ventilated. before the courts.
What do you think that the public is not understanding, that perhaps you've not been able to persuade for them to not be as outraged as they are?
Well, I suppose the judgment of the Constitutional Court, it's quite a complicated judgment. And it's been my experience, and it's not just confined to people who may not necessarily be trained as lawyers, but even lawyers who haven't studied that judgment tend to take certain views that are not informed by the ruling of the Constitutional Court. A further complexity is the fact that there were negotiations. The negotiations were behind closed doors and confidential. Then the CEO's decision, which hasn't been made public, and in the minds of many members of the public, there's missing bits of information, and to put the pieces together, it's difficult. As a result, there is some degree of consternation around the perceived behavior of our company. We're obviously concerned about that because of the reputation of our brand. But at the end of the day, we believe our involvement in the negotiations with Mr. Makate were in accordance with the judgment of the Constitutional Court.
Did the Please Call Me make any money for MTN? I mean, for Vodacom. My apologies.
So in our books, there aren't any revenues that are directly attributable to the PSM service, the Please Call Me service, in other words.
So you can't connect someone sending a message and then receiving a call soon after?
I think unless you make quite extensive assumptions, it's impossible to draw those connections.
So then what's the point of the service then if it's not going to make money for you?
So it is a fact that at the beginning of the service, it wasn't making money. We originally planned to charge for the service, but because there were other products or services in the market which were similar in nature, and our competitors were not charging for them, we equally didn't charge for the service. And I think after about 4 years or so of experimenting with the product, there were discussions in the company that it's a problematic product from a perspective of network congestion and the fact that we're not making money out of that product, and that we probably need to think about canning the service, as it were. But what subsequently happened, I think other product services which could be laid on top of the Please Call Me service resulted in a situation where some money was being made. Was being made, and therefore the product was never terminated, as it were.
Are there any legal implications for you vis-a-vis MTN and their invention of a similar product, if not the same?
So in the nature in which the telecom sector operates, it's often common that someone would develop a product, go to market, launch it first, and the rest of the industry become followers. Now, the benefit of whoever goes to market first is the first mover advantage. So same with Please Call Me. MTN at the time went to market first with a similar product. Now, I'm not saying the same product, I'm saying it's similar. I think it was called at the time Call Me Back. And they were first to market by some 3 months or so. But Vodacom was also, and I'll admit, prompted by the idea that came from Mr. Makate. We're also looking at developing the same concept. But it's important to emphasize that what Mr. Makate brought to Vodacom was a bare idea which was called BAS. Then you need to develop it into a service or a product. You require technical input. You require a capital outlay. Mr. Makate didn't make any contribution so far as technical input, capital outlay, and the marketing costs.
However, you were bound by the former employee and this agreement that he had. What did that former employee ever say to you about the nature of the conversations that he had with Mr. Makate?
So, we've never really discussed the situation with him directly, but in the course of the litigation that played out between Vodacom and Mr. Makate, what was evident was that Mr. Makate had come up with an idea, and that at some point when there was some acceptance that Vodacom can go to market with his idea, which had now evolved into a service that today we call Please Call Me, he then started writing correspondence to this former employee and say, we must talk compensation.
Okay. All right, perhaps finally, so you're not moving in terms of the offer. As far as you're concerned, that's the final offer, and you wait now for any court action that might proceed.
So it's not an offer, it's a determination by the Vodacom Group CEO in his judicially sanctioned role as a deadlock breaker, meaning there were discussions between Vodacom and Mr. Makate to agree reasonable compensation, and those discussions failed. And it's important to underscore that it was Mr. Makate who declared the deadlock and said, well, we can't find each other. I don't accept the number that is on the table coming from Vodacom, and therefore I'm going to escalate the dispute to the Vodacom Group CEO. As a deadlock breaker, the CEO determined a number that he considers fair and reasonable. And from our perspective, that number is final and legally binding unless found by the courts to be reviewable, reviewed, and set aside.
All right, Mr. Nyoka, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very, very much indeed. Thank you so much indeed for your time.
My pleasure.
All right,
Thanks,
you.
Peter.
All right.